The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, this bill is entitled the Victims' Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill, and the reason that we have it before the House tonight is because there is currently in place no long-term mechanism which the police or the courts can use to prevent an offender coming into contact with the victim in the absence of a domestic relationship or evidence of deliberate harassment. This bill was designed to address a gap in the system. The Domestic Violence Act provides protection orders for people, usually women, who have been the subject of domestic violence. The Harassment Act provides protection against, for the victim against those who continue to harass them. But there is nothing in the current legislation that deals with the situation where a person who has been the offender against the victim can harass them silently, if you like, by their presence. What this bill tries to do is to prevent things such as the following: watching, loitering near, or preventing or hindering access from the victim's place of residence, business, employment, educational institution or other place that the offender knows that the victim might visit. It's about stopping a person from following or accosting the victim. It's about stopping people making contact with the victim, which is unwanted contact. Some people might say that when an offender has served his or her prison sentence, then their rights need to be upheld alongside the rights of anybody else in the community. My view is somewhat different from that. Yes, of course, offenders do have rights, but those rights cannot be superior to the rights of the victim not to relive the suffering that they had inflicted on them by the offender by seeing the presence of that offender in their community, near their place of residence or at their place of work or education. There was a gap in the law. This bill closes that gap, but let's not exaggerate the impact of what this legislation actually does. The Select Committee found out that there are 1,000 people each year released from prison who would meet the sentencing criteria for being covered by this bill. But equally, officials have said that this will apply to a very small number of people. We don't know what it was. Originally, as the Minister had drafted the bill, it would apply to just 10. And I've got to say, when I read the regulatory impact statement, Mr Chairman, I was really worried about everything that I read in that statement that suggested that what the government was doing and the officials were doing was premised on what the cost might be of extending the rights of the victims. Indeed, you look through the options that were put up and they said this would be quite costly, we can't do it. Well, let's start to think about the costs that are inflicted on the victim and the need to protect the victim, and that's what this bill is supposedly about. But I want to say that while this bill, as the title suggests, is about orders against violent offenders, it is a drop in the bucket in terms of the actual problem of serious violent offending in our community and serious sexual offending. I had the terrible task, Mr Chairman, earlier this week of visiting the family of the Henderson dairy owner, Arun Kumar, who was murdered in his shop in Henderson. Talk to the family and try to find words that are adequate to match the suffering of that family. An elderly dad who'd lost his father, a wife, Anita, whose husband had died before her eyes and in her arms, 2 children who know that their dad will never be there to be the grandfather for their children. And you realise that when we talk about victims, we're not simply talking about statistics. We're talking about people, real people, and the enormous suffering that so many people have inflicted on them in our community. Suffering of violence and suffering of sexual assault. And it's time we in this House did more than just the token efforts of saying we'll patch the system here or we'll patch the system there. It is time to look fundamentally at what is going wrong in our society and to build the fence at the top of the cliff rather than trying to make sure the ambulance at the bottom might arrive on time. And when the offenders, as in that case in Henderson, were the age of 12 and 13, you know, Mr Chairman,
The Honourable
you know that there is something fundamentally happening that is wrong in our society, and if we think that we can fix that by small pieces of legislation like this, we are sadly wrong. We have to do more to address the causes of offending. That requires much more than legislation. We have to do things that ensure the system works. In that case in Henderson, you've got to ask the question, why were a 12 and a 13-year-old not at school, and what was happening to make sure that they should be at school? You have to ask the question, why a 13-year-old whose father is in prison and his mother is constantly before the courts is left to his own devices, and nothing in the system is there to put him on the right track that might have prevented him from stabbing the dairy owner as alleged in the neck, Mr Speaker. That's why we need something more than simply this piece of legislation. We need a change in the system, and in terms of sexual offending, we need a system that will respond to individuals in a way that does not frighten them away from the system, but allows them to come into the system in order to see justice done. And when 1 in 100, Mr Chairman, only of those who are victims of sexual violation get justice through the system that we have at the moment, we know that the system is simply not good enough. So the Labor Party has come into the House at each reading of this bill and supported the bill for the small but useful things that this will do for a small minority of victims. We will always support the victims, but the bill, as the title suggests, is no panacea, no widespread solution, no answer to the fundamental problems that after 6 years have not been addressed by this government. And it's time not to make this into a political football, but a time when this House should come together and say, let's do something more than tiny pieces of legislation that apply sticking plasters. Let's do something to make sure our system works. Let's do something to create a society that addresses the causes of offending. Let's do something to have a policing system where the police do not have their budget cut every budget for each of the last 5 years, so we have fewer police staff out there working in the police force, fewer police stations, because that is the track record. In Henderson, the thing people told us on the ground as we went from shop to shop was what we really needed was a community police station in this town. What we needed was to see our police out in the street. What we needed was some intervention when we could see the problem out there, that the system would respond to that problem and prevent the problem, because after the damage has been done, it's too late. So I say to the Minister, it's fine to have this small, narrow piece of legislation. We will support it. We will support it if it helps just one person. But it's time to have a system that actually works for the greater good of a greater number of people, addressing the causes of offending, having a policing system that is visible on the ground and works properly, and a justice system that encourages people to come into the system and see justice done, because for far too many people today, justice is not being done.
The question is that clause 1. I call the Honourable Member David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just want to take a short call, and clearly the Chair is in some, has some